Long before we watched Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures, there was a husband and wife duo, Ed and Lorraine Warren, whose life mission was to prove to the world that things in our nightmares really do exist, and that only through proving their existence could we have a real chance at fighting back. In my last video, I mentioned them when I discussed the haunted doll Annabelle. So if you missed that one, don't forget to watch that one when you're done with this video. In this video, we are going to look at a couple of their more notable cases, ones that have been immortalized on the big screen. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark. From deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes, and this month a special spotlight on the spooky for our creepy countdown to Halloween. So if that's your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. Ed and Lorraine Warren were each born in the 1920s in New England in the state of Connecticut. Each was a Catholic and grew up believing in the existence of things that cannot be seen with the naked eye. Ed lived in a haunted house as a child and remembered seeing orbs of floating light and in disembodied voices. When he tried to tell his father about what was happening, his father dismissed him, telling young Ed that there was always a logical explanation for things, even if he never gave Ed any. It was his father's skepticism that led him to search for the truth as an adult. Lorraine Moran, later Lorraine Warren, began having her own experiences as around 9 years old, which included seeing auras or spiritual fields around a living person. After being scolded by a nun for speaking about her experiences, she kept her abilities quiet, never even telling her family what she could do. This pushed her also to search for the truth. When Ed and Lorraine were 16 years old, they met each other at a movie theater. Lorraine was a regular moviegoer, and Ed worked at the theater as an usher. It wasn't long before they began dating. From then on, that they were a couple, staying together even after Ed joined the U.S. Navy during World War II. Just months after joining the service, he had a near-death experience in which the ship he was on collided with another. I couldn't verify which ships were involved because none of them quite matched up with his account, but many sailors died in the incident. Yet Ed survived and saw it as a divine miracle. The survivors were given 30 days leave, and he used that time to return to Connecticut, just long enough to tie the knot with Lorraine on May 22nd, 1945. After getting out of the Navy at the end of the war, Ed Warren began supporting the family as a painter, selling paintings featuring houses and other buildings. During one trip, the couple visited a haunted house in New Hampshire called the Ocean-Born Mary House. It was then that Lorraine had a trance-like episode which spurred on their interest in the occult, specifically hauntings. Within a couple of years, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research, and they began conducting investigations into hauntings. All right, it's that time again in the video where I ask you to help me out. Literally takes a moment, costs you nothing, but helps me grow my channel. Hit the like button down below. If you really like this video, then do me a favor and send it to another morbid soul. All right, let's get back to the fun stuff. One of the more well-known haunting investigations of theirs involved the Perron family. The case today is better known as the Conjuring House. Yes, as in the movies. The Perron family lived in the house and consisted of Roger and Carolyn and their 5 daughters. They noticed that the house was haunted the day that they moved in 1971. The oldest daughter, Andrea, was carrying in a box when she saw a man in the house who she assumed had known the previous owners and was there for some unknown reason. Her sisters came in and they saw the man slowly vanish before their very eyes. It was 9 years that they lived in the house, and they experienced all sorts of things. Not all of them felt evil. Some of the entities that they encountered felt friendly. But hoping to have a completely peaceful home, they called in Ed and Lorraine Warren. When the Warrens first showed up at the Harrisville, Rhode Island house, the predominant spirit that Lorraine felt was a female one. As they often did, the Warrens suggested a seance. As Lorraine is conducting the seance, the mother, Carolyn, is suddenly picked up out of her chair and is thrown to the ground, and she begins speaking in tongues, obviously possessed. Her husband, Roger, who was apprehensive about the whole thing, was completely overcome with terror and tried to rush to help his wife. Ed Warren stepped in between the two, worried that Roger would get hurt. As you can imagine, just wanting to protect his wife, Roger took a swing at Ed and hit him hard. As chaos continues, not knowing what to do, Roger kicked Ed and Lorraine Warren out in the middle of the seance. Now, this investigation went down as a failure, and they were never allowed to return to the Conjuring House. But, considering its fame today, I couldn't not mention it. 3 years after they visited the Conjuring House, the Warrens took on a case which is probably the first that got any real attention. It was the haunting itself that made the news, and not the Warrens' involvement, but I thought it was still a good one to mention. They were first introduced to the case by Mary Pascarella, who was a psychic medium and a researcher. She called Ed Warren and begged them to come help the Gooden family. Their house at 966 Lindley Street was supposedly haunted by a poltergeist. The case was already gaining considerable public attention because by the time the Warrens showed up, there was a police presence. The fire department, the media, and a crowd of people were swarming outside of the house. Estimates put the numbers at around 2,000. A priest by the name of Father William Charbonneau had also been called in. When they went inside the house, it was in complete disarray, with notable damage throughout. Furniture was thrown about the room, and the walls were damaged with holes. Ed Warren, as part of his investigation, recorded interviews with those at the house, including police officers. Even they, men in uniform, said that they saw objects moving by themselves and heard and saw the result of things moving while their backs were turned, even just for a second. Multiple officers professed to have known and to have been witnesses to things that could have only been caused by a poltergeist. Ed Warren had to see for himself, and he did. He reported that he saw dishes smash and a plastic crucifix explode. When asked by Ed Warren when everything had started, the couple who lived in the house revealed that it had only been the night before, and it started with a bang. They had just got home from grocery shopping. They had placed some of the groceries on the kitchen table and went out to get the rest of them. The table lifted itself, throwing the groceries onto the ground. Then dishes and knives from the knife block were thrown from their places. They cleaned up their kitchen and hoped that whatever it had been was over. But it wasn't. Tables and chairs throughout the home began moving on their own. Chairs were knocked over, tables completely flipped. Not knowing what to do, they called their neighbor, John Holsworth, who was a police officer himself. He was the first person outside of the Gooden family to witness the haunting, as he saw several things in the house move on their own. The family and the first people to witness the supernatural happenings didn't automatically blame spirits or the devil. Like most logical people do, they tried to come up with a logical explanation. They even called the city to ask about a possible gas leak. A city engineer showed up at the house and was shocked to see with his own eyes the refrigerator move from one side of the kitchen to the other. As you can imagine, they realized this was absolutely not a gas leak, and a priest was called in to bless the house. The priest, Father Charbonneau, went from room to room, blessing them as he went, and everything seemed to be going pretty well, until they ended up in the basement, because the creepy shit always happens in the basement, or the attic. It was in the basement that a black figure appeared to Father Charbonneau. As quick as it appeared, it disappeared again before his eyes. Just then, Lorraine Warren, who had been upstairs in the kitchen during the blessing, suddenly yelped in pain. Her hand blistered as if she'd been burned. Lorraine was known to be a sensitive, and after the poltergeist turned its attention to her, Ed and the priests agreed that it was probably best for her to leave, at least for the night. The following night, the Gooden's daughter was physically picked up and thrown before the eyes of Father Charbonneau's assistant, Paul Eno. He himself went on to be a respected paranormal researcher. Anyway, after seeing the girl attacked, the Warrens, Paul Eno, and Father Charbonneau all realized that it was probably time to conduct an exorcism on the house. It was the next morning that the head of police declared that the whole thing had been a hoax put on by the little girl, because, yes, a little girl is capable of moving a fridge all on her own. Even if you are a skeptic, I do have a hard time believing that a kid her age, only 10 years old, would be capable of coming up with a hoax so complex and believable that it caused grown-ass police to believe in ghosts. As you can imagine, thousands of people hanging around one single street could create a huge nightmare for police, and of course they would have to shut it down. Unfortunately, the best that the superintendent could come up with to get rid of this problem was to blame a child. I guess I can understand it, especially if he didn't believe, but morally it's a hard pill to swallow. Even though it seemed to put an end to the circus, the police within the department didn't believe it. And many went on to give private interviews where they told their own stories. Turns out that the Catholic Church also didn't believe what had happened had been real, so they refused to send out a qualified priest to perform the exorcism. The family, who had already gone through so much, struggled with all the attention and quickly withdrew. Even though phenomena continued to happen for a while within the house, the family was not eager to talk about it. And eventually, people, for the most part, stopped talking about the Lindley Street poltergeist. And these days, the story lives on mostly through internet articles and podcasts. There are a couple different theories regarding what happened in the Connecticut home back in 1974. We've already addressed the hoax theory, which everyone close to the situation had vehemently denied. One theory does place blame on the little girl, but as an unwitting perpetrator. The girl had been going through intense loneliness and isolation caused by school bullying. She'd even been beaten up so severely that she required medical attention. It's thought that her extreme emotional distress manifested itself through poltergeist-like activity, like Stephen King's Carrie. The other theory is that her anguish allowed her to be spiritually susceptible to dark spirits. They locked in on the girl and used her energy as a power source for their poltergeist activity. It's time for the trivia question of the day. I think I made the question a little bit too hard last week. The question was, there is a legend that says homes that contain even replicas of this series of paintings by an Italian painter have a tendency to burn. What are featured in these paintings? And the answer was crying children. Now for today's question. The first person to comment the correct answer down below will get a shout out in the next video. The public's interest in the Lindley Street haunting was probably spurred on by this famous horror movie, which came out the year before in 1973. There is one case that the Warrens were involved with that has gotten far more press over the years, and is the case that put Ed and Lorraine Warren firmly into the consciousness of everyone even remotely interested in the supernatural. And even if you aren't a fan of horror movies, unless you live under a rock on the most remote island in the world, you have heard of Amityville Horror. Amityville, not to be confused with the fictional town of Amity of Jaws fame, is a nice suburb on Long Island. The town wouldn't be famous if it weren't for the house found at 112 Ocean Avenue. The house first gained infamy when 6 people were murdered on November 13th, 1974. They were the DeFeo family, Ronald Sr. and his wife Louise, and their 4 children, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. Notice that I said Ronald Sr., yet there was no Ronald Jr. It's no mistake. Ronald Jr. wasn't included in that list because he was the one who found them all dead. Although it's not really finding them when you're the one who left them that way. Each of his family's bodies were found in bed, on their stomachs with their arms outstretched above their heads, each dead by gunshot, as if everyone slept through each gunshot, not knowing that they were going to be next. Ronald was only 23 when he slaughtered his whole family. When confronted with evidence, Ronald, or Ronnie to his family, didn't deny it, but what he did say would go on to inspire nightmares. He claimed that an evil entity he had encountered in the basement gave him the rifle and made him kill his family. As he walked through the house, he kept hearing voices egging him on. Kill them, kill them. He got rid of the weapon and then went to work like nothing happened. He went on trial the following fall, and in spite of pleading not guilty by insanity, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty of all 6 murders and spent the rest of his life in prison, dying at age 69 in 2021. If that's where the Amityville story ended, I wouldn't be talking about it in this video. Amityville's story continues on with the next family to move into 112 Ocean Avenue, the Lutz family. George and Kathy Lutz first saw the house, and they noticed that the house was surprisingly affordable for the affluence of the area. They fell in love with the house during the viewing, and they felt a pull to the property. The real estate agent confessed the bloody secret that the house held, but after consulting with Kathy's 3 young children, the family decided to go for it anyway. Pretty creepy, but the Lutzes bought the house fully furnished, as in the furniture in the house was the furniture of the murdered family, including the beds. At least they had the house blessed by a Catholic priest, although it didn't seem to work. Later, during an interview, the priest said that he heard a demonic voice while performing the blessing. He didn't tell the Lutzes, and they moved in a week before Christmas. Their experiences began immediately. At first it was George, inexplicably waking up at 3:15 every morning, the time that the murders occurred, and Kathy began having these vivid nightmares about the murders. According to the children, their once loving parents were becoming increasingly cold and rigid and even violent in their discipline of the kids. Although it was winter, they complained that the house was unseasonably cold. Less than 1 week after moving in, they began finding strange black stains within the toilets of the house. And in the sewing room, where the priest had heard that demonic voice, there was a sudden infestation of flies in December. On Christmas morning, after being woken up at 3:15 a.m., George noticed that the boathouse's door was open. Worried about theft, he went out to check on it and closed the door. Everything seemed fine, but on his way back into the house, he looked up and saw the shadow of a large figure in his stepdaughter's room, his 5-year-old stepdaughter's room. You can only imagine the terror that he must have felt, and he raced to her room. He swung open the door, only to find that she was alone and fast asleep. It shook him, and he began to question his own sanity. Just the next day, Kathy heard her daughter playing in her room, and she swore she heard another voice. She opened the door and saw, again, that the daughter was alone. Or was she? The child-sized rocking chair in the corner was moving back and forth by itself. Her daughter had an imaginary friend she called Jody. Other strange experiences continued to happen. A room in the basement would sometimes have this terrible and overpowering smell. A green jello-like substance began appearing on the upstairs hallway carpet. Black oozed from the keyholes in the doors, deafening sounds that only one person could hear. In mid-January, everything came to a head when the Lutz family decided to try to bless the house on their own. They said prayers moving from one room to the next, and they had no idea that the attempt had been so unsuccessful and really only served to piss off what was ever haunting the house. As a storm raged at 3:15 the next morning, George was woken by banging noises coming from the room over his head, his stepson's room. He looked over and saw his wife wasn't in bed, but was levitating over it. George couldn't do anything to help her, as he felt unable to move, paralyzed. At the same time, he could feel the presence of something at the foot of his bed. He could also sense unseen presences moving throughout the house. The children's beds floating and then slamming back down on the ground again. Even the poor dog wasn't safe. He would get up and run around in circles with his tail between his legs before getting sick and laying down again, only to repeat this over and over again, howling. The front door opening and slamming. Bam, bam, bam. Then, as suddenly as it all began, silence. Each member in the family stayed in bed, whether unable to move or too scared to move. It wasn't until the sun came up that anybody left their rooms. They, not surprisingly, called the priest, who told them to immediately leave the house, and it took them most of the day to pack up what they could as they left the house, not ready to give up on their dream home. Their story began to get around, and a reporter reached out to the Lutzes and asked if she could interview them and possibly do an investigation. It was that reporter who called in, you guessed it, Ed and Lorraine Warren. It was just over a month after the family left on February 24th that the Warrens first arrived at the Amityville Horror House for the first time. A few weeks later, the Warrens participated in a seance that was conducted in the dining room at midnight. Present were two psychics who did the actual communing, and it led to the Warrens determining that the house would indeed have to be exorcised. They finished up with the seance, and everyone split up to do their own kind of thing. The Warrens moved throughout the house, with Lorraine using her abilities to get a better feel for what was happening. Lorraine went to the second floor, and she began feeling depressive emotions, and she could feel spirits almost mocking her. She felt the urge to go into the sewing room. The room felt far more foreboding than any other location in the house. Lorraine said it felt like hell itself, and even with her decades of experience at the time, it was too much for her, and she left the room in a mental haze. She later had a hard time recalling the rest of the night. After that experience, the Warrens deemed the house in Amityville, Long Island, New York, as the most haunted house in America. A book was written about the house, Amityville Horror, followed by more than a dozen movies and remakes of those movies. And as for the Warrens, they went on to become famous as the husband and wife who investigated the Conjuring House, Annabelle the Haunted Doll, and America's Most Haunted House, Amityville Horror. They opened a museum and have had many documentaries made about them, guest starred on talk shows, attended movie premieres, and, even after their own deaths, live on in our minds, never truly dying. And that's it for today. Again, like and subscribe. Try your hand at the trivia question down below. Also, if you're looking for more spooky Halloween fun, check out these videos. As always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.